From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. In the early hours of July the 7th, 2005, 4 men gathered in Luton and boarded a train to King's Cross. Arriving at the height of the morning rush hour, they parted ways, joining the throng of commuters crossing London, which on that day included Thelma Stober and David Skiffins. For them, the day had started like any other.
Thelma woke up in an amazingly euphoric mood because London had won the Olympics the previous day, and lots of Londoners were super excited about that. But she had particular skin in the game because she worked for the London Development Agency as a lawyer at the time.
I led the setting up of the bidding company and led the legal work that was necessary to demonstrate that we could stage the Olympics here.
So she'd been working really hard, and then when they won, there was just this sense of absolute euphoria.
It was an amazing day. We were expecting to win, but it was a bit of a shock.
Yeah. So she was supposed to take the day off on July 7.
I had promised my son, who was 3 at the time, to take that day off and to take him to nursery.
She honoured her promise to her son. But then she was starting to think about the Olympics and she was getting really excited. She was going to continue the legal work all the way through up to 2012. So she knew she had just an enormous pile of work on her desk. So she thought, I'll go into the office for a few hours.
And that was the reason why I was on the train later. Normally, I'm a very early person.
I remember it was on the news. The Olympics goes to London, and that's all coming out. And everything was good. Everything was happy.
David Skiffins was a Detective Constable in SO13, which was then the Metropolitan Police's anti-terrorist command. He'd been an officer for many years.
I'd worked all the crime squads, burglary squads, robbery squads, drug squads.
Yeah,
then
the traditional route.
Traditional routes, worked then up to...
And he lived in Hampshire at the time, and he commuted in every day.
I remember it was just like any other day, no concerns, no worries, rushing in to London, coming up to Waterloo East.
Gets into Scotland Yard, and everybody's got the TVs on.
We'd always have the news channels on, and it started about surges.
And there's talk of power surges across the underground.
We thought nothing else of it other than, what could be causing this? Is it the summer, the heat?
So Thelma comes in to London from Hertfordshire on the mainline train, and she transfers onto the underground, and she finds herself on a Circle Line train heading west.
Walking towards the platform, I saw the train just arrived, so I ran for it.
And it goes into Aldgate. And she sends a text.
When we got to Liverpool Street, I got signal. So I tried to send a text to my office to say, I'm going into the office, organise these meetings.
And the moment that she pushes that button...
As soon as I pressed send, there was a white light.
And then it came out on the news that London was under attack.
In the course of an hour, the 4 men who'd arrived at King's Cross had spread out across London, and each had detonated a homemade suicide bomb, unleashing the largest terror attack in London's history. 52 people and the bombers were killed. Hundreds were injured. The Story today, 7/7, 20 years on.
I'm Fiona Hamilton, the chief reporter at The Times. I was actually working as a journalist in Australia when the attack happened, although I remember it very vividly because it was such an enormous event, and contacting friends in London to check that they were okay. And I moved to London the following year, and I became London correspondent of the Times. And one of my early-ish tasks was to cover the inquests into the bombings, which took place for 5 months from 2010 into 2011. I think there were about 75 or so days of hearings, and I covered virtually every one of them.
Fiona, 7/7 was a huge day in the memory of any Londoner. You know, everyone has a memory of where they were when it happened. You've gone back and spoken to some of the people who were directly affected by it. Tell me about Thelma and David. Starting with Thelma, just talk us through how the day played out for her.
So Thelma came to on the train tracks, and she looked around, and there's dust and soot and all sorts everywhere.
I found myself on the train tracks. I was partly underneath the train and partly off. And part of the door was on my right thigh. And I could see the door was awful mangled.
And she said there was a moment of silence, but then the screaming started. She could hear people screaming, and she could see bodies around her. And she felt the hand of a man on her forehead, and she pushed the hand off. And she looked around, and she said she realised she was quite severely injured.
My left foot was kind of turned backwards.
She didn't feel any pain, interestingly, and she told me that she just thinks the brain shuts down. She felt no pain.
I could see blood profusely. I had no pain whatsoever. It's incredible.
And at that point, she could see people in the distance sort of walking through the tunnel, and that people were going to other people's aid, but she'd been thrown quite away from the carriage. And she said, I thought,
I don't want to die because of my mother, my son, and I really want to be part of this Olympics.
And witnesses at the time can remember her calling.
I tried to put my hand up and say, help me, I don't want to die.
And there was the officer from British Transport Police who had rushed into the tunnel with no thought of his own safety to try and help people. And he went to her aid. And there was a fellow passenger who also went to her aid and gave her his jacket and kept her talking. Thelma's quite a funny person, and, you know, you do an interview with her and you cross between the utterly devastating impact that this has had on her life, but also moments of real humour.
I remember him asking, what's my name, where I live, where I work, what I did. Were you married? Do you have children? And he was asking me over. So at one point I said to him, why do you keep asking me the same questions over and over again? But of course, what I subsequently realised was I was in and out of consciousness, and he was trying to keep me alive, conscious.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to have gone through. What happened to her?
Thelma was, I believe, the last survivor to be taken out. And she was taken up on a stretcher. She was taken to the Royal London Hospital. And this is what I mean about her humour. She sort of says, I remember ticking off the ambulance driver because he didn't know the way to the Royal London.
I had this gas mask or whatever they put, you know. And the medical person was holding my hand to keep me warm because I was cold.
Yeah.
And I said, how come he's an ambulance driver and he doesn't know his way to the hospital?
And she was told that it was such a massive incident that they'd had to pull in people from outside London who didn't actually know where they were going. And she got to the hospital and she was surrounded by people in white coats.
They wheeled me in and all these nurses came around me. And I said, you need to take this down. You need to take down Stephen's number, Ken Livingston's number, my chief executive. You need to tell them that I've been involved in an accident and I'll be coming to the office later.
Of course, she had no idea of the scale of severity at that point.
And they kept saying to me, you have severe injuries, we need to save your life. And I said, I know that, yes, but you must do this.
They had to amputate her left foot and lower bit of her left leg. And she wears a prosthetic now. And she was told that she might lose her right leg. And she told me she became very depressed by that.
I was on suicide watch.
Oh, gosh.
Because it then dawned on me the significance of what had happened to me.
She had really serious internal injuries. Her whole back was severely burned.
And I lost my hearing when I was at the hospital.
Tell us a bit about David and what happened to him over the course of 7/7 and the weeks that followed.
So David was deployed to Russell Square and would never have imagined it, but he actually spent the best part of 3 weeks in that tunnel.
When you do your induction training on SO13, they teach you to the best of their abilities, and they are very, very good. But none of that prepared you for a bomb scene.
So the job of David and about 15 or so other colleagues at Russell Square was they were sent into the tunnel when the last survivors had been taken away to hospital. So they walked into this tunnel and they saw the carriage.
It was ghostly to see. You saw the carriage there with the driver's door open, the steps going down where the driver had gone out.
26 people died at Russell Square, plus the suicide bomber. And so it was a scene of really unimaginable horror.
It's just silence, and you just knew this is horror. It's not going to be nice.
And it was his and others' job to completely clear that scene and utterly, forensically, perfectly, so that, first of all, people could find out exactly what happened to their loved ones.
These were people in the prime of their lives, just by sheer misfortune, were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Of course, remember, there's a hunt at the time for who exactly the bombers are, what the device was.
What you're looking to do as well is you're looking to try and identify the device. You're also looking for evidence of, say, batteries, electric cabling. There could be lights, little bulbs that could have been used to initiate the explosive. Again, you're looking for anything like that, evidence of receipts in an address.
It's really important to get that right, to get all the exhibits that you can get. Are you chasing down accomplices? Were they instructed from somebody else? All those sorts of issues, and finding out what's in that carriage and what was used to commit this attack is obviously crucial to that process. David has not really spoken about this publicly for 20 years. And the reason he spoke to me was that he wanted to get a message to the families of the deceased on 7/7, that he and his colleagues treated their loved ones with the utmost respect.
They've almost become part of your family.
Yeah.
And you know that person has loved ones above ground, and you've got a job to do because you know they're grieving and they will be grieving, and you've got a job to do to bloody well get them out of there and return them. That
they were as gentle with them as they could be, that they cared for them, and that they wanted to get them home to their families so they could have proper funerals, proper burials. And he's very traumatised by what he went through. But I think he feels a real sense of peace and a sense of accomplishment that they were able to do that.
I mean, it must have been horrific being down there for 3 weeks in a tunnel with just what's left of the utter horror of all these lives that were ruined.
Yeah. I mean, what he experienced will never really be made public because it's horrendous. And they did not leave that tunnel until every last person was brought up to ground. So that took over a week. So the team just slept on the platform.
We were sleeping literally in amongst all our equipment and our gear.
Because you didn't have time to go home.
We didn't have time. We couldn't go home. We had to stay there. So when we were doing the bodies, we were literally working around the clock, 24/7.
They basically bagged the bodies and they were taken out. There were sadly lots of body parts. So they would basically box off squares in every part of the carriage, and each of them would be responsible for a small square, and every exhibit within that would be properly, carefully bagged and tagged, and then checked by other officers and then taken up to the top. And when they were removing the deceased, he said he talked to them and said, "I'm sorry we're having to do this."
Just saying, look, we're going to get you out here. Sorry about what we're having to do, but we will be getting that. We'll be getting you back to your families.
Yeah.
And the feeling of that was awful.
And then they were still there for another week and a half, perhaps a little bit more, because at that point they had to focus on all the other exhibits. There were documents, there was clothing.
Metal put in one bag, all the bits of cloth in another bag, all the bits of, say, what looks like electric cable, electric wiring. Could come from a mobile, could come from a laptop, could come from the device. So they'll all go into another bag, bits of paper in another bag. So they're all separated out.
And all of it was because of the scale of this massive bomb that ripped through that train. It was all under 0.5 metre or so of debris. So you were literally sifting through debris and dirt and whatnot to get to the exhibits. So it was a heck of a thing. They had a makeshift funeral service down in the tunnel. They bought a wreath and they said a few words.
The service was at the end of the 3 weeks. By then, I mean, these people, I call them people, not victims, people, they were our family. You know, we were with them 3 weeks. We were getting them out of there, and they did become our family. We had utmost respect for them. So we decided we'll get a wreath, and we wrote our details on there from us, SO13.
And then when they left the tunnel, they had 2 rest days, and then they went back to work.
Fiona, you've been telling us about the extraordinary experiences of Thelma Stober and David Skiffins, 2 of the people who were there on the day on 7/7 and whose lives were changed by it. There was an inquest into the bombings and into the response to it, which you covered for the Times, and, you know, as you said, you covered it day in, day out. What do you remember about the inquest?
It was just really vivid to me on the horror of that day. I mean, we heard in so much detail about the last moments of every single victim, exactly how they died, the extent of their injuries, but also the human element of it all was so poignant, how some of them died being held by other passengers, how people went to their aid. So that was just terribly sad, actually. And then I think the other thing that really struck me and will stay with me forever was just the bravery of people like Thelma Stober. But there were just day after day after day, we heard these incredible stories of heroism, but also just the sheer courage and determination and bravery of people who suffered unimaginably bad injuries and were sort of able to walk into the Royal Courts of Justice and tell us about their lives.
And Fiona, at the end of that process, what did the inquests find?
So Lady Justice Heather Hallett, who was the High Court judge who oversaw the inquests, she came up with a whole string of recommendations. There were some pretty important ones that I think have had a crucial impact. So recommendations to better regulate the quantity of materials that can be sold that can be used as bomb ingredients, because the bombers were able to buy large quantities of certain chemicals without alerting the authorities at all. The big part of the inquest was the fact that the bombing ringleader, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, had been on the radar of MI5, and there had been opportunities to perhaps look at him in a bit more depth, and he was dismissed as not being somebody of importance. So she made recommendations about how they handle suspects and information about suspects. But in the 20 years since, the world has developed so much, and the world of AI in terms of being able to cross-check information about people who are on the radar and what might come up as red flags. It's just been totally overhauled. I think the key, really important aspects of the inquest was her assessment of the emergency services response and just how poor it had been. Totally failed communications, complete failure to talk to each other at the top of police, fire brigade and ambulance. Their walkie-talkies didn't even work in the underground tunnels, which meant that messages couldn't be relayed properly. And when they were relayed properly, they weren't acted upon properly. People who were in the tunnels saying there'd been a bomb were dismissed. And the whole thing was total chaos. So she made a series of recommendations about better communication, better resilience, better training. And so it was pretty shocking, really. Years later, I was up in Manchester for the inquiry into the Manchester Arena bomb, in which 22 people were killed in 2017. And I just sat in this courtroom reading the inquiry's findings, and it just took me back to the July 7 inquest. There were so many errors that were made yet again, exactly the same. And, you know, we hear this, it's just a trope by institutions in public life that lessons will be learned.
Yeah.
And what was really clear to me in Manchester, and what the judge in the Manchester Arena found, was that lessons had not been learned. And in fact, crucially in Manchester, and this differed to 7/7 because Heather Hallett concluded that despite the poor coordination, the poor response, nobody died who might have survived. But in Manchester, the conclusion was that one person might have survived had he got quicker and better first aid.
Do you think anything has improved? I mean, you mentioned how AI made MI5's job a little bit easier.
Well, I think for the security services, 7/7 was a huge reckoning. So Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the ringleader of the bombings, had popped up on MI5's radar the previous year because he was associating with people who were plotting a separate terror attack. And the question was, what exactly did MI5 know about him? Should they put him under surveillance for longer? And had they done so to prevent these attacks? Now, it's important to say the coroner found that even had they taken more steps, had they looked at Khan more closely, had they surveilled him for longer, she thought that the attack still would have taken place. So that was a huge reckoning for them, and their processes were overhauled, and the way they deal with suspects on their radar and people who are on the periphery of attacks are treated differently now.
And Fiona, since 7/7, it felt like sort of the first attack we knew, sort of on British soil, but it was the first of a spate of terror attacks across Europe. How much has that threat changed more recently?
Well, the threat has changed really markedly because, of course, 9/11, 7/7, the Madrid bombings, they were what became known as terror spectaculars. So really carefully planned, massive events. But over the years, we haven't seen that anymore. The reason for that is the advent of technology, the ability to intercept phones, to follow suspects. A lot of that has changed and made it more difficult for them to coordinate in that way. I also think that post 7/7, the security services and police got better at disrupting these plots, at monitoring people who could be involved and all those sorts of issues. But when we saw the advent of the Islamic State caliphate, they went down a path of propaganda and incitement to violence that was very different, which was, you don't need to plan a big spectacular, just get a knife and go and kill as many people as you can with that knife, or use a car, which we saw to devastating effect in Nice, and also at London Bridge and in Westminster, where cars were used to ram members of the public before perpetrators used knives to carry out attacks. And I think the people who have been planning these attacks have realised that that can be just as effective, because what is terrorism about? They might say it's about changing policy, but we all know that's not true. It doesn't have an impact in that way. What it does do is it sows fear, and actually the people behind those smaller but devastating attacks have been able to sow fear, and that's what they're trying to achieve.
Do you think groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are they so diminished that we can take our eye off them for now, or, are they sort of waiting in the wings?
Are they waiting in the wings? We know there's parts of the world where ISIS is trying to regenerate. Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan is a big watching point at the moment. Those ideologies have not gone away. They've just manifested themselves in a different way.
Fiona, we began by talking about Thelma and David. 20 years on, how are they now? How has Thelma's life evolved? How has she had to live with her injuries?
Well, I suppose you'd see it in stages. So first of all, they had to save her life. And then she's got to rebuild in terms of being able to wear a prosthetic. And she said to me, you don't just put a prosthetic on and walk off. It takes months of rehabilitation.
I'm told that it will take 6 months to a year to get a prosthetic limb and to be able, because they have to train you.
So she was, first of all, in intensive care or wherever in the hospital, and then she was moved to an injuries unit where she could have that rehabilitation and have the prosthetic fitted and all those kinds of issues. She had all sorts of other battles along the way just in relation to that. For example, Thelma is a black woman, and she was told she would have to have a white prosthetic.
What the hospital said was, for me to get one with my skin tone would have to be bespoke. And that wasn't something they provided.
She was told, well, you just have to sort of wear trousers or hide it. And so she had to lobby to be able to get the funding to get the right colour prosthetic. There's those acute injuries at the beginning, but then they have an impact on her for the rest of her life.
I was somebody who was very active. My parents were professional ramblers, so we used to go lots of walks. And we used to do holidays that will have a bit of walking and a bit of relaxation.
Yeah.
Of course, my walking is severely limited. And I used to run in the morning. I can't run anywhere unless I can afford to buy £50,000 running that Olympians wear.
She told me she doesn't wear clothing that would show her burns.
I've never been able to wear anything that will show even my back. I don't wear short sleeve. Because of my amputation, I don't even wear shorts.
Yeah.
I would always wear a dress with a collar. I wouldn't wear something that's round neck, low neck, because it shows my back.
The reason for that is she's not ashamed or embarrassed, but she wants people to know what happened to her because she's chosen to tell them, not because they see her injuries and ask.
I want to explain to somebody what happened to me because I chose to.
Yes.
Not because people are looking at you.
She doesn't go on the underground. She's tried twice, both times for TV documentaries, and it's just been too distressing.
I get to the front of the escalator. It's as if I'm nailed to the ground. I can't put one foot in front of the other to get onto the escalator to go down. And I begin to feel panic attacks coming.
She travels around the country doing the mentoring and doing talks and helping people. And before she gets on the train, she calls the train provider.
And I have to speak to the train providers people. How many times you go on a tunnel and how long does it take? And initially they used to think he was an odd, of course of security.
Yeah.
They started asking why you are,
All right, yeah.
And I would say to them, first of all, I'm going to be asking you some questions which seem strange. Go up and look Thelma Stober's story, right? For them to check that I'm genuine.
But she has to calculate that in her mind, and then she'll close her eyes, she'll listen to music. She gets through it, but it's not something that she can just get on a train and go. Ever since the bombings, she's been complaining of headaches. Sometimes she loses her focus, her ability to focus.
In 2019, after many medication, etc., I had a scan and it transpired that I've got shrapnels in my brain.
It's okay. She's just having regular scans to check its movement. It's not something that those acute initial injuries are treated and then it goes away. It stays with you for the rest of your life.
And Fiona, how is Thelma now? And how does she think about what happened to her?
Well, Thelma's great. She lives a full, happy life. But she has these obstacles.
You lose spontaneity. But I never say I can't do something.
She has to plan for everything. She has to plan when she meets people. She has to add time because it will take her a bit longer. But she has a happy family life, successful career. And she's close with some of the bereaved, and the bereaved are actually really important to her. And she makes that point that everything she's gone through, she's still here. And so she's very mindful of that as well, I think. When she was in hospital in the very early stages, she read an inspirational book by Nelson Mandela.
I remember a passage, and it says, one must have hope, faith, and determination in the midst of disasters, unimaginable disaster. And that kept me going.
And her mother visited her and said,
God had a purpose for your life. Use your second life to make a difference, to continue to make a difference to society.
I think she's achieved that.
And what about David? How did what he had to go through impact his life after the event?
I think in 2005, I'm not sure, the police and emergency services, well, I don't think anyone was prepared for this. And I'd like to think these days they might be a little more sensitive and supportive about issues of trauma. David has only started talking publicly recently about what he went through in that tunnel. And he says that talking about it is really helpful, that he needs to get it out. And I suppose it's a kind of therapy in a way. He's now retired, lives a happy life in retirement. And I think he just looks back on it with a sense of pride that he was able to help and that he was able to, do what he could in the worst of circumstances.
We were proud that we'd got him back. And if that had been my loved one, I would like to think that, none of them is still down there.
Is he able to talk about it with the people around him?
He talks about it with his former colleagues. He's talked about it with his partner for a very long time.
I talked to her about it and, I break down. But she gives me a hug. She's very proud of you.
And he's actually going to the memorial on July 7 for the first time. He's going to meet some of the families and have those conversations with them, which I think for him will be a really important moment.
That was the chief reporter for The Times, Fiona Hamilton, and with profound thanks to Thelma Stober and David Skiffins. There's more coverage of the 20th anniversary of the 7/7 attacks at thetimes.com and on Times Radio. The producer today was Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Molly Guinness. Sound design was by David Crackles, and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.